Welcome, everybody. It's good to have you with us. Welcome, whether you're with us live or whether you're watching this on replay. I'm Simon Buckingham-Shum from the Connected Intelligence Centre here at UTS, and I have got a fabulous team with me today, and we're going to be sharing with you the journey that we have been on, learning how to use language models for a very particular purpose for staff rather than students. You can see at a glance here who we've got, but they will each introduce themselves to you as they join the presentation, sharing what we've been doing over the last year. So we're going to be talking about how we developed a suite of Course Handbook Bots, a little family of chatbots, but for staff rather than students. Before we go any further, though, I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands UTS City Campus now stands, where I am and where some of my team are. But do please drop into the Zoom chat whose lands you are on if you are somewhere else. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. And as we talk increasingly about AI, I always find it quite cosmic to think about the 50,000 plus years of knowledge and insight on these lands, even as we start pondering what it means for machines to start displaying intelligent behavior. But we won't get into the philosophy of whether they are actually intelligent today anyway. This is the overview of the session. I and Sharon will introduce a little bit about the context of this project, where we had to revise our UTS Course Handbook. Susan and Catherine will talk about from the IT perspective, how we were building up our AI capability. Danny will talk about the first taste of prompt engineering, and then Josh and Shabani will talk about the journey of tuning the system prompt to get the bots to behave. Sally will talk specifically about, could the AI actually design an Indigenous CILO? She'll be explaining what that is. And then we have Amanda and Lee, who are speaking from the perspective of the faculties who are on the receiving end of these redrafted descriptions of their courses and subjects and how that felt from their perspective. Then we'll wrap up and move into some Q&A. Speaking of which, there is a Q&A button down in your toolbar. If you can't see it, maybe hiding under the more ... button there. So do please post questions there that you'd like us to pick up, but feel free to drop thoughts and comments into the Zoom chat just as a sort of back channel, but it will help us spot the questions if you've posted them in the Q&A. Okay, I don't think there's any more to say, so let's just get into the context for this. So the challenge is that back in January, we had to revise a large amount of our curriculum data. And you can see the numbers there: 550 course descriptions, 348 course intended learning outcomes associated with those courses, and then the constituent subjects making up those courses. That's the language we have here at UTS, a lot of those as well. Why did we have to do this? Well, because we were moving to a new course management solution going live in July. And we wanted, for consistency and intelligibility right across the curriculum, to have 6 or less course intended learning outcomes. So an easily graspable number for a student who was browsing this course as something they might decide to enroll in. And then 5 or less subject learning outcomes for each of the constituent subjects. As you will see, we had a huge amount of variability across our handbook. We wanted to revise the writing style as well to be more student-centered and a consistent length, so an even kind of tone of voice, a much more engaging way of describing what the student would learn and what their experience would be. But this was not about course revision or curriculum transformation. This was simply about redrafting without changing the underlying meaning. As you will appreciate, revising courses is not something that you just get a bot to do. That's intensive intellectual work from the academic team. We are not here to improve or revise the course, but to improve and revise the description of the course and its subjects. Okay. So we wanted to go from something like this, 26 silos for a program there, to about 6 silos, one of them being an Indigenous one. And I'm just going to invite Amanda and Lee, if he's here, to just share a moment. What was the feeling in the faculties at this point in the beginning of the project?
Yeah, so when we first found that this was happening, it was sort of interest, but some concerns about losing control. Where academics are used to sort of owning, in a sense, their curriculum and their subjects. And so there were some questions, is this the way of the future? The bots kind of taking over a little bit, kind of doom and gloom, but also I think a little bit of staff expertise. Generative AI was very new to all of us. And we'd really been looking at it from the perspective of the student. So this was probably the first time for most people that they'd looked at it from the perspective of their own professional practice. And so in some sense as well, that was balanced with some kind of cautious optimism that maybe this sort of technology could start to save work in kind of strategic places. And so if it could save time on some of the probably slightly lower value work, revisions and that sort of thing, that maybe that ultimately would be a good thing.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. And Amanda was coordinating for the Arts and Social Sciences faculty. Okay, so that led to this workflow, a multidisciplinary team designing a chatbot to try and produce broadly satisfactory output, which then moved to the subject support team working with a particular text from the handbook in order to get a satisfactory revised draft and referring to technical expertise when required. And finally, then sharing that draft with the academic, who would then review, edit, update, and finally approve. So the human is very much in the loop here. We weren't just handing over a bot to the faculties and wishing them good luck. There was quite a lot of quality control going on centrally first. Okay. Going to pass over to Susan now, I think, who's going to talk about building our generative AI capability with Catherine.
Thanks, Simon. Great to be here, everyone. My name's Susan Gibson. I head up data analytics and AI within the Data Analytics Insight Unit. So my role is really responsible for rolling out AI across the university. The challenge we had was that there was a lot of interest in AI and generative AI. We had built capability on predictive AI, but very early days in generative, both from our capability, but also building out our infrastructure. So our role was really to work out how we can do that at speed, to make sure that we can continue to innovate alongside all the people who are so keen across the university. So the way we went about that was we went out to the university and asked who would be keen to be involved in what we had, the transdisciplinary teams, which we called Tiger teams. And we brought across about 40 people together to enable that work. That we then did some training. We engaged with Microsoft, who ran about 3 days of training across all those people, ran some Art of the Possible workshops. And then from there, really decided to break into 3 different teams. One that you're going to hear very much about today, which is all the teaching and learning work that we did to build out these handbook bots. We also had a research team, but the important thing was to have a technical team running alongside these teams as we had to build out the infrastructure. And we did that in 3 different stages. And Catherine's going to talk through those 3 different stages that we worked through with our solution design and security teams as well.
Thanks, Susan. I'm just making sure that I'm coming up on video, am I? I can't see there. Yeah, I am. Okay. Yep. Great. Yes, my name is Catherine Fogarty. I'm a senior business analyst in the data and analytics and AI team, working for Susan. And I want to talk about our stage approach to this infrastructure. The first phase really talks to the development of these Course Handbook Bots, and basically we set up an Azure OpenAI chat playground, and that gave us all the various Tiger teams a safe place to experiment and learn about this technology. And that started only a year ago, really, in December last year. And out of that came the Course Handbook Bots. From that point, we wanted to be able to talk to our own data. And so that spearheaded the beginning of phase 2 in February this year. That was a RAG architecture was implemented in the test system, and then that was deployed to production in September. So from there, we started to develop other bots, the subject bots from the KIC team, staff policy bots, IT cyber bots, various other chat bots. And after we did that, we then came across the challenge that we needed to be able to scale that up. For instance, we could secure our data in separate deployments for each of the subject bots, for instance. But if we wanted to roll that out to, thousands of subject bots, potentially, that would be thousands of deployments. So at that point, we needed to look at something that was scalable, and that's when we started developing our AI framework. That started in October of this year, and at the moment, we're looking at deploying that early next year, and that'll give a safe, scalable, and equitable AI, generative AI capability across the whole of the university. Thanks.
Thanks, Danny.
All right. Well, it goes on to me. As Catherine was just mentioning, I should introduce myself first. I'm Danny. I am a learner experience strategist within the education portfolio. Essentially, what that means is I'm basically a business analyst. I'm between the interface of education requirements and IT. So they brought me in to sort of help bridge the gap, I guess, and I could actually see a new system in play. Just talking to what Catherine was just mentioning, they set up a nice chat playground for us. And as the name suggests, this is a nice place where we can kick the tires and have a play around. This is all new technology for us. And I think this sort of environment helps us acclimatize the SMEs and stakeholders and build that adoption and capability where this is all new things for us. So if the screenshot's not fantastic, but essentially we got to have a look at all the toggles, all the choices that we have as SMEs in setting requirements. So whether we pick a particular model, see if that works well for our use case or not, for our new model. We also learned about like max response, how big we want the context window, the temperature, how random do we want the responses. So a lot of us got the chance to sort of play with all these parameters, move them about, and just kind of test the waters essentially and get us more comfortable. It's like learning a new language. So there's like tokens, top P, there's all these foreign words that we're not quite used to, but in the playground, it just let us play around with them, see what it does, and slowly build our knowledge so we could take it to the next step. And the next step is actually working with our nice engineers like Shibani and many of in Susan's team to start building that first system prompt, which sets the role and the tone for the CILO bot. And that's pretty much it from me.
Thanks, Danny. Right. So my name is Antoinette Shibani, and I'm a senior lecturer at Transdisciplinary School, and I came to work with the team to support on the prompting side of things. So as Danny mentioned, we were working with the playground to get started to build this AI bot. We started with crafting the prompt. So what it means is basically giving instructions for the bot to do what we wanted to do. So the prompt here are coming from early versions of the bot, where we're explaining what a silo is to the bot, its purpose, what makes a good or a poor silo. And the original bot was about 2 to 3 pages long. It doesn't fit in the whole screen here. It even had a whole list of the Bloom's taxonomy words that you see on the right. Move to the next slide, please. All right, so from there, we went on to tuning the prompt further. So this screenshot is actually the prompt history, which shows many versions of the prompt for the CILO bot. With every version, we redefined all of the requirements, making sure the bot can perform reasonably well, starting from defining the minimum requirements for each silo, defining what the output file structure could be, and asking the bot not to over summarize based on trial and error, but also with subject knowledge, refining the bot to do its task. So we went up to probably version 16 with some minor and major changes in each prompt. Next slide. We also tested some follow-up questions using which the learning designer can further ask the bot to revise or review the outputs that were provided, because we wanted to utilize, the chat capability or the dialogic capability of the chatbot. So for instance, they can ask the bot to check if it has used all of the minimum requirements, if it has given 6 silos, or ask it to even regenerate it if we want to get a different wording. Next slide, please. And once we had a prompt that we were reasonably happy with, there was a lot of systematic testing, which was much more intense and rigorous, with many, many use cases, mostly from Danny and Josh's team. So they collected a lot of use cases from different faculties, from law, sports, IT, nursing, etc., more verbose ones, less verbose ones, making sure the bot is performing reasonably well in all of those cases. Next slide, please. Then the complexity there was evaluating these complex outputs, which were also quite subjective. So there's sometimes no right or wrong answer to it, but we need to make sure that the bot is performing reasonably well. So they came up with some acceptance criteria, which allowed for minimum reprompting, but ensuring that the outputs are reasonably well. So another difficulty was also the inconsistency of the outputs, because the bot might generate different outputs even if you're giving the same prompt. And they ensured there are multiple stages of this kind of user acceptance testing. So that involved a non-subject matter expert checking for the number of silos outputted. If all of the old silos are mapped, it cannot miss any old silos. And then the curriculum team reviewing the quality or the wording of the iSilos on the silos. And then the iSilo team will be reviewing the iSilos for quality. So you can see that there are multiple stages of testing. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then here it is. This is the final prompt, which was the silo bot. And you can see this is actually a much stripped down version of the original prompt that we had. It's got shorter and simpler sentences. We got some support from a consultant to optimize and settle on this final prompt. And it didn't have any details of the purpose or good or bad silos, etc. But it had some key instructions, and some of them were also repeated at the end to make sure that all of the original silos were integrated and mapped. And yes, I think there it is. So this is how we went from these n number of silos for any subject to the synthesized set of 6 silos, which also maps back to the original silos to where it came from. Yep, I'll pass it on to Sally.
Hi everyone, my name's Sally and I'm a senior lecturer with the Indigenous Teaching and Learning team. And our team is responsible for governance of the IGA, which is why I came to this project as part of the Tiger team. I work with Professor Annette Gainsford. She's the Indigenous Teaching and Learning Associate Dean. So what I wanted to do is give you some background on, I guess, what an iSilo is first. And so it actually defines the learning around achievement of UTS's Indigenous graduate learning outcome. What I would say is this, I came to this project with absolutely no language or skills around AI, so it was a huge learning curve for me. But what was key to my involvement in it was consultation with my Indigenous colleagues who guided the prompt and also the testing. So can I have the next slide, please? First thing we did, as Shabani mentioned, we guided the prompt with resources. So in terms of the Indigenous course intended learning outcome, we gave it Indigenous authored resources. These included our UTS IGA curriculum framework. We also had examples of good iSilos. We used appropriate terminology. We gave it resources from the Luicha Institute around deficit narrative, and also the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health curriculum, which guided the prompt, I guess, in a way. Next slide. So this, as Shibani had shown, this is actually the iSilo prompt.
And we will make these slides available afterwards if you want to look at these in more detail.
So in this slide, this is an example of what the Silo bot was able to do. So what I wanted to do was talk about what it did really well, actually, based on the prompt. So you can see there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 original iSilos, and it was able to summarize it. It was able to differentiate Indigenous Australian from global Indigenous outcomes, and also able to uncouple them from equity categories, which can happen quite often. It used appropriate writing conventions, capitalizing Indigenous, First Nations, Aboriginal, and Torres Strait Islander. It also pluralized people to reflect the different cultures and languages of around 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations using peoples. Sorry, can you just go back to that other slide? It also deleted offensive acronyms. You can see there. It used Aboriginal only to classify another noun, such as Aboriginal person, Aboriginal community. It highlighted the professional capability focus of the IGA, which is skills-based, aligned to the profession. So you can see the SiloBot came up with demonstrate advanced cultural capability. Next slide, please. What was interesting that it didn't do so well, which I've highlighted here, it sometimes didn't replace the subjective words such as respect, sensitivity, and awareness with skills or capability that are easily demonstratable and assessed and marked as a result. It also didn't identify negative collocations such as Indigenous issues. So you can see that the SiloBot replicated responsibility, which is, an intangible term. And also, when we talk about Bachelor of Communication, communication with Indigenous communities was an improvement on the previous about. And sorry, next slide would be good. This is actually the course team as this degree was up for reaccreditation. And really, it shows the human input and the consultation that is required for an iSilo with integrity, let's say. So, thank you.
Thanks, Sally. My name's Josh. I'm a lecturer in academic language and learning in the teaching, learning and curriculum unit. And I was part of a small team, Sharon, who's here today, and a few others who aren't, whose main role was to actually feed all of these. Once the prompt was sort of finalized and the bot was operationalized, was to feed all of the data into the bots, review all of the outcomes, all of the outputs, make sure that we were happy with them, make any tweaks that we thought might be necessary, and then send them through to the faculties for final revision and approval. The original plan had been to get the faculties to put the pieces of work into the bot themselves, partly because we were worried that we would become a bottleneck and sort of slow the whole process down. But we decided in the end that we would actually put it through the bot and revise the outputs first. And there were two reasons for that. One was that we were concerned, as Amanda indicated earlier, there was concern across the faculties about, can these bots actually do this kind of work? What do they know about our courses? What do they know about our subjects? So we wanted to make sure that whatever was going through to the faculties had some kind of quality assurance review before they saw it, to make sure that both we and they were comfortable that what was coming out from the bots was, if not perfect, at least sort of something that would give them confidence that the bots were doing a good job. The other thing that we needed to keep on top of was whether once the bots were sort of finalized and put into operation, were the outputs remaining consistent across time? And the only way really that we could be sure of that is if we kept feeding everything through the bots and we kept seeing all of the outputs before they went to the faculty, so that there was one small team who could check that there weren't sort of things that were consistently going wrong, or if inconsistencies started creeping into the responses in any way. But all of the work that everyone's been talking about so far was pretty much focused on just the CILO bot, but actually there were 4 bots that we had to use and 4 pieces of work that needed to be done. So as well as the silos, there were also subject learning objectives that needed to be revised, and then subject and course descriptions, which were in the existing course handbook, which all needed to be revised before the new curriculum management system came in. So we were building bots for each of those 4 pieces of work. Next slide, please. And so for the course description bot, for example, a lot of what we learnt from the CILO bot got also applied to the Slowbot, the rather amusingly named Slowbot, the subject learning objective bot. But the course descriptions and subject descriptions was a completely different sort of set of circumstances. And essentially what we were trying to do here was take existing descriptions of a course or a subject and revise them to be more student-centered. That was the brief that we were given. What student-centered actually looked like, kind of, we had to figure out in consultation with a variety of different people. We spoke to some faculty representatives and a few different people to try and get a sense of what that might look like. But essentially the rules that we ended up with is what's on the screen there. That's not actually the prompt that the bot had, but the prompt was kind of based on this set of rules. This is the rules that was given to the faculty, so that when they received the outputs, they could, if they wanted to make any tweaks and changes, that they were still fitting those changes within the existing rules or guidelines for what it should look like. And you'll see there were 4 key elements of the structure. It should talk about who the course is aimed at, why students would choose that course, what skills and knowledge they'll gain, and how they will learn. So when we were doing the testing, what we really needed to make sure was that all 4 of those elements were captured by the bot's output, and that the tone was right. Next slide, please. So I know there's a lot of text on the slide. One of the difficulties of presenting something like this in a PowerPoint presentation is that this was a very text-focused project. So I'm not expecting you to read all of the text on there, but essentially what I'm trying to highlight here, this was an original course description from the handbook before it went through the bot. The parts highlighted in yellow, the first few examples you can see is examples of passive voice. So our research-informed curriculum is focused on, the course is focused on, curriculum is informed by. I didn't mean to pick on any particular course, but this was just a good example of a fairly typical course description in the previous version of the handbook. A lot of use of passive voice and a lot of use of third person. So students with an interest in the Master of Forensic Science, students complete, from there they can. So a lot of use of third person as well as the passive voice. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see a draft revision output from the bot. And again, I'm just highlighting here a few key things, which is the much more active use of language. So mostly removing passive voice and often starting with a verb to make it really active. Choose this course for its practical focus. Enhance your career with. And obviously the use of the second person to more directly engage the student. You'll gain hands-on experience. You will learn through. One thing I did learn through this process is just how triggering contractions can be for some staff. You'll gain hands-on experience. There are a few people who were absolutely horrified by the thought that we'd be using contractions in something as formal as this. Obviously, the bot doesn't care one way or the other. It just goes on whatever instructions you've given it. We did, however, say to staff, if that's something that you can't handle, that's fine. That's within your control at the end to make those changes. But if we go to the next slide, the only thing really that I want to show between this and the next slide is how little change there is. In terms of the length, the bot generated version was a lot shorter than the original, which is mostly what we're aiming for, because a lot of the original course and subject descriptions were very, very long. And the student feedback, when we did some research with students, the feedback was that it was too long for them to bother reading. They'd read the first paragraph or so, and then after a while they'd just drop off because there was more information there than they needed. So the bot-generated versions were much shorter than the originals. The approved versions on the whole, and obviously it differed from course to course and subject to subject, and I think we'll hear from Amanda again soon about their experience of receiving these outputs. But generally our experience as the course team overlooking this was most of the approved versions were pretty similar to what the bot had generated. So this was an approved version here, minor bit of tweaking from what the bot had given them, but essentially the structure was the same, the style and the tone was the same. They might just add in a couple of extra details that they felt were essential to properly understanding and describing the course, but essentially it was pretty similar to what they had been given. Thank you.
And thanks, Josh. So we then went to the AI operations board. So we have an AI operations board, which is very much central to our governance of AI at UTS. It manages anything to do with ethics or risks associated with products that we implement, but also manages the pipeline and prioritizes the work that we do within AI. So the team came along to the AI Ops board and presented the work they had done, some of the learnings and some of the outcomes, which was great. What they did do as well is seek approval. So they worked through the ethics processes. We have 5 different ethics principles that we have in our policy. They're from a community benefit. So was this a community benefit? Obviously, the amount of time it saved in the development of this material, but also the quality of the output at the end provided a community benefit both for staff and for students. The fairness one, Sally talked a lot about the CILO bot, which was the most sensitive one, but working with the SMEs around that ensured that we were applying principles correctly. So we worked very closely on both the development of the prompt, but also oversight on the final product as well. Privacy and security is another principle, and we spoke about the technical team earlier. On there we had cyber people, and we worked through the IT solution design process, and that's where we had different stages that Catherine touched on. Transparency, we were very open about the work we were doing. We were using AI, as Josh spoke about, and accountability, that we had an overall owner of the AI, but also we worked through a very structured testing process that you saw before as well. So it did get approved by the AI operations board, and we moved ahead.
Thanks, Susan.
Good. So back to me. I didn't introduce myself properly last time, but in FAS, I was the teaching and learning coordinator in one of the schools, and so sort of was helping to act as sort of a conduit between the project team and academics, as well as being one of the academics myself. So I received some of these for me to work on, as well as taking them out to teams. It was actually really interesting. I think there was, as we've talked about before, initial resistance, some concerns. I think Joshua mentioned, even down to the wordings, some people were a bit unsure because a lot of it represented a bit of a change in how we'd phrased things before. And that was probably actually the biggest sticking point. Once people, generally speaking, got past that, actually started engaging with the output from the bots, they were a lot more positive about it, found that it really did save some time, which is quite hard to quantify, but that's sort of anecdotally what people were reporting. To an extent, though, it depended on kind of the quality of what went in. So this was particularly the case if it had been some time since the previous reaccreditation of a course, maybe if no one had really reviewed some of the subject learning outcomes for a while. There were places where sort of I was in meetings where people would go, gosh, is that really the way that we wrote that? We probably needed to tweak it a little bit. So some of those discussions probably didn't add time, but certainly that's where the effort went. We found that the course intended learning outcomes presented the greatest challenge. There wasn't an awful lot of debate around the descriptions. They were generally considered fine, the subject learning outcomes as well. The silos was sort of an interesting one because ensuring their intent wasn't changed. So being very careful to check the wording, and also making sure that everyone understood that it wasn't a redesign. And there was a little bit of confusion around that to clear up, that this wasn't necessarily an opportunity to go and fix things, but that this was, you know, a different kind of process. In my particular faculty, we had a particular way that we'd sort of mapped graduate attributes to the course intended learning outcomes. That actually took a little while, but that sort of was something that was just a little bit unique to us. So anecdotally, by the end, I think people were sort of pleasantly surprised. They found that the quality of what they got out was probably better than and more effective than what they'd expected. We did have a few jokes though about the bots seemed to really prefer some words like delve, and they really loved learning journey. But once we got past that, it was overall a pretty positive experience.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. Okay, so just to wrap up then from this, and Sharon may jump in on this as well and introduce herself as well. So we did deliver the handbook on schedule. Sharon, did you want to speak a little bit about that and any other aspects of this?
So, hi everyone, I'm Sharon Coots. I was the project coordinator of the small group that Josh and I worked together to actually use the bots and deliver the project in terms of data revisions across the university. And we absolutely did deliver on schedule, on time, which was fantastic. And when we did our initial calculations early in the piece, we realised very quickly that without the bots working on the 4 streams, there's actually no way that all of those data revisions could have been done in time for 31st of January hard deadline. And so the beauty as the user of the bots managing that project was it did give us certainty that we could get it done. They absolutely enabled us to have a conversation starter with faculty. So just speaking a little bit more to what Amanda was saying, it enabled us to, as a product that we generated, put a flag in the sand and start conversations with academic staff and give them somewhere to start. So I think it was invaluable in terms of engagement. You know, often the hardest thing to do when you're writing is to write the first sentence, but here it was actually done for you and it gave us somewhere to start. You know, it was an enormous project in terms of the items of data that needed to be reviewed and revised. So from a project perspective, it was absolutely a success, and it could not have been achieved without all of the background work and everyone here that enabled the framework for it to take place. And so as a pilot, it was fantastic. And, you know, I would encourage anyone to, you know, work with the people around you to do this. But that's a perspective from the project manager of the end user of the bots. So, Simon.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, so we've foregrounded that decision we made also about keeping people in the loop. You know, remember that diagram I showed at the beginning that showed that, you know, Josh was that middle cycle, checking that sane things were coming out of the bot, having the conversation with it, trying to improve it before that was passed to the faculties for review. And in terms of where we're going next, you know, every one of you who's in an Australian university will have responded to TEXA around the assessment reform in the age of AI, and the use of tools like this to help design and improve the curriculum is very much part of how we envisage AI helping with our response to TEXA in that regard. As you'll recall, this project was not about changing the curriculum. It was just about changing and improving the presentation of that curriculum in a more student-friendly way. But improving and designing curriculum, there are many opportunities that we have as part of our response, and we have shared that publicly, and you can take a look at that. Susan, do you want to just say something briefly about where we're now going with the Gen AI infrastructure?
Sure. I think Catherine spoke to that a little bit. So we are building out the infrastructure to be able to scale what we now have. So we had some really good foundational work done, but now we've got the infrastructure where people can bring their own data and create their own bots without relying on data teams to be able to do it for them. so we'll be scaling that and rolling that out in the new year.
Yeah, brilliant. And that is all obviously that provides the ability for people to safely experiment with confidential UTS documents of any sort, rather than going off to random companies with servers in random parts of the world, etc., which make absolutely no guarantees about the confidentiality of your data. And we are also improving the literacy of staff with an introductory Canvas module, which they have the opportunity to take. That will be launching any day soon. So that is the end of our little story for you. A lot of learning right across the university with a very diverse team, as you have all now heard from directly. We're very happy to take your questions. You can either post them in the Q&A panel or stick your Zoom hand up and feel free to ask the question yourself. But thanks very much for your attention. Okay, we have been fielding questions in the Q&A during the presentation, so you can look at the answered questions already. There's a question there about, are we going to give a demo of the bot? No, we're not going to give a live demo of the bot, but you know, the essence of what we did, you know, you have seen in the slides. Does anybody want to stick their Zoom hand up to ask a question or post anything in the Q&A panel?
While we're waiting, I might just jump in and say one, because that question about the live demo of the bot just reminded me that we went around early on in the project to each of the faculties to explain to them what was coming, what was happening, and what their role in this would be. And originally the plan was that we would do a live demo of the bot in each of these meetings. But at that stage, it was very early days of building the bot and of really revising the prompt. And we were still finding a lot of inconsistencies with the outputs at that stage. So after doing a couple of faculties where we did a demo of the live bot, my heart was always in my mouth because I had no idea what was going to come out at the time. And it might produce something brilliant and it might produce something not so brilliant. And there's all these people watching us going, you know, should we trust these bots or not? I think my heart couldn't take it anymore after the first few faculty roadshow meetings. So eventually I suggested we stop doing the live demo and just tell them that you know we would start sending them some bot outputs once we had finalized the bot.
Yeah, and in fact, Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the end, this was a tool. This was really a back office tool that you were primarily using, and were you just using the playground mainly in the end as your workbench?
To a large extent, yes. One of the reasons for that was because it allowed us to be very flexible. So, for example, with the subject learning objective bot, on the whole, it was easier than the CILO bot, but sometimes it got tricky because there are a few subjects, thankfully not too many, but a few subjects that have a really, really large number of subject learning objectives, often ones that were related to professional competencies. So each professional competency that they were required to demonstrate for professional accreditation purposes was captured in a different SLO, subject learning objective. So we had a couple of extreme examples where there were 80 or more subject learning objectives that had to be condensed down to a maximum of 5. Because of that huge number that had to be condensed, we found the easiest way to deal with that was, rather than just trying to send through 5 new subject learning objectives for approval, we revised the prompt to just, in the first instance, categorize these 80 SLOs into 5 general categories. And then from that, if we could get approval from the faculty on the 5 general themes or categories, we could then work with them to sort of flesh that out into actual subject learning objectives. But because we kind of had to go through approval process if we wanted to change the prompt and get it sort of the bot republished in a sense, it was easier just to do that kind of work in the playground. So a lot of the final work I was still doing in the playground, even though we had final versions of the bot, just because it allowed a bit more flexibility to change the prompt for specific circumstances.
Right. Okay. Now we have a question. I'm going to throw this to anyone in the team who wants to pick it up. If we were going to do this again, would we have done anything differently? based on what we've learned this time round. Well, perhaps we would have spared Josh's heart failure and not put him in front of the
That's right. No live demos.
quite so early. But any other thoughts on what we might have done differently?
I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts. I don't know that I would do too much differently. I think our main concern at the beginning, I think, was whether we would actually get through all of the work in the time, because we had a pretty tight time frame that we were working to. And I think our initial concern was how long it was taking to get the CILO bot prompt right. There seemed to be a lot of testing and retesting and inconsistencies in outputs. And there are a few people here, Danny, I know is one of them, who would have seen me in my various freakout stages going, I don't think this is going to happen. It's just not getting there. But I think all of that initial time spent trying to get the prompt right at the beginning and doing all of that testing and fine-tuning really was worth it once we got to smashing through the bulk of the work. And once we got going with actually putting everything through the bot and revising it, then I was like, oh, this is really working well. It's making a huge difference. It is saving us a lot of time.
Yeah,
but yeah, that I think it was worth spending all that time early on making sure that we were happy with what we were doing. But at the time, I was really starting to get to a point where I was like, is this actually going to be worth it? Are we going to reach a stage where we go, we can't even actually use this? And now we're going to have to go back to doing it all manually, and we've just used up a whole bunch of time. So I don't know that I would do that differently. I think in hindsight, it's easy to see that it was worth it. At the time, it was harder to know if it was going to pay off.
Yeah,
I think we started with the hardest one too, right? But we probably didn't
Definitely.
realize that at the time. So the CILO was the most difficult. So we may have got going faster with one of the others.
Shibani, did you have a thought on
Yeah, I
that?
just wanted to add to what Josh was saying, because I also agree there's a lot of value in this whole process, because we learned along the way. We sometimes had to redefine our requirements to see, are we asking the bot the right thing? Should we change what we're asking? So I think it's not just about the end product or the final revisions, but it's our whole process of learning along the way, and the steps involved in it were all very important. So yeah, I also don't think there's a lot would really change.
Carl has asked a question related to this about how we decided what to include or exclude from the system prompt. Speaking as I wrote a long and elaborate system prompt in that initial workshop that Susan and Catherine were describing, and was very pleased and excited about this, how well it was working. But then was dismayed to find that Josh and Shibani were gradually whittling it down to something leaner and leaner and leaner. And it was still working, well, it's working better than my prompt. So verbosity, being an academic, it turned out not to be necessarily the best thing. I don't know whether Shibani or Josh want to comment on that. But for example, I provided the entire list of Bloom's taxonomy verbs. Turns out it already knew those perfectly well, and we did not need to clog the prompt up with that every time. So yes, it got very lean and mean by the end, didn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So the final prompt, if you see what we shared in the last slide, it only said begin each silo with a Bloom's taxonomy verb, and that's it, because the large language model already knew what Bloom's taxonomy was and all the words that have been there. But also the length of the prompt meant that some of the instructions were not getting followed by the prompt, possibly because it forgot a bit when it came towards the end, which means cutting it down and making sure some of the key instructions are definitely followed actually helped. So the shorter prompt helped in the end. So those were also kind of, I guess, good learnings for us as we work with prompts.
Sharon, you want to jump in on that?
I think as a secondary consideration, and as the user of the bots once we got them to where they were, I think it's really worth considering how are you going to present what the bot outputs are, and how are you going to interface with the people that you need to do it with if that person is not actually connecting with the bot directly themselves. And that was the case in this instance. And so we had a lot of complexity that we had to think through and overcome in terms of producing, in excess of 4,000 pieces of work, and then interfacing that with faculty, what system were we going to use? How are we going to collaborate with that? How are people going to access that? It was really complex. And then how are we going to then get that data exported into a format that could be used in our circumstances to be able to upload into our new curriculum management system? So in fact, once we tweaked the bots and got them to where they needed to be in the end state where we were producing the work, the real complexity for our project then came in all of the next steps. And it's required ongoing work there. But I think, Josh, you would agree, that's been for us a really tricky element of it as the project team.
Yeah, and I think that was largely just due to the sheer amount of data that was that was being revised in such a short amount of time. There's also there was a good question in the chat about, will the course handbook declare that the content has been written or drafted by AI? The best of my knowledge, the answer to that is no. I haven't heard anything about that. It's actually it's a very interesting ethical discussion. I don't even recall that topic being discussed. I think there were so many other things to think about and discuss in our various project team meetings along the way that never came up. But I believe the answer to that is no.
No, I don't think so. It's a back office tool that will be used, in hundreds of thousands and millions of organizations to accomplish what they have to do. Organizations are accountable for what they do, just like we tell our students, you are accountable for what you do, and you will have to learn when to use AI and when not.
And we were transparent to the staff who were receiving it, though. I think that's where we position the transparency, and they had the final say on the output.
Yeah.
Yeah, just on that, Susan, we were really clear in those interactions with staff that this was a draft version of what was generated, and that we were always reliant on that content level expertise to either agree with it, change it, tweak it, throw it out the window, whatever they needed to do with it. So,
yeah,
but there was the occasional interesting discussion, and maybe this shows a bit of the psychology of how humans will interact with bots in the future. Is that there were a couple of times where people indicated they were nervous about changing the output because it's like, well, the bot has clearly generated, this is like the right version in a sense. I can't touch it, I can't mess with it. And our feedback was always very much, well, you can. In the end, you're the subject matter expert. You need to be comfortable that it is accurately representing your course, your subject. But some people were fine to go in and change it, but there were a few people who seemed very reluctant to disagree with the bot, or kind of, suggest that the bot's output wasn't perfect.
Yeah, as we're learning from our students, we have diverse responses from our staff as well, who have varying degrees of readiness and comfort with it, from embracing it and wondering why we're not using it more to being very cautious with it. There've been a couple of questions about the availability of this outside of UTS. Well, we have shared the prompt with you that you'll be able to take that straight from the slides and try that out in your own favorite bot if you want to. So the bot is not released as such, but you can literally take that prompt, experiment with it, improve it. Maybe we'll put it out there under a Creative Commons license, and because I've done that with some of my other system prompts and bots, and you just take and improve it and share it back, and it can be a little bit of an open source thing. That's one of the exciting things about this economy of bots now. Okay, I'm just scanning the other questions. Have we changed the process for creating new silos by default? The answer to that is no, not at the moment. But this got good enough as this is my perspective. It got good enough as a back office tool used by Josh, who became an expert power user with it. But that there is a difference between that and publishing a bot, which is meant to be a sort of walk up and use bot that works to a degree with a user experience that's good enough that any member of staff could just come up and start getting great results from it. So I think we need to be honest here. It got good enough to save thousands and thousands of hours of faculty time, but that's because we had an investment in our learning as a central support team in order to save the faculties at that time. So that may be an important distinction for you to think about in your own minds. Back office tools that are aiding productivity, but may not necessarily be ready to be published as a quotes consumer bot for untrained people. That just takes more work, more training, more validation.
I might just jump in there though, Simon, if that's all right, and say, although all of that is true, we did have a case after the project had finished of an Associate Dean Learning and Teaching contacting me out of the blue to say, we've got a new course that we're working on. We haven't come up with the silos yet, but we've kind of got a basic kind of description of the course. Do you reckon the bot would be able to generate some course intended learning outcomes for this course? And I said, well, that's not actually what this bot was designed for. But by this stage, I was pretty confident to go, you know what, though, you just play around and let's find out. So let's tweak the prompt a bit and see if we can get it to do that for you. It very quickly generated a set of silos, which I sent back to the ADTL, and she was very happy with the output. Now, obviously, she hasn't necessarily picked it up and taken it and used that, but I presume that was used as the basis for whatever they did end up coming up with. So the learnings from that for us can be applied to other things, and I think that some of the end users from the faculties will have been able to see both the prompts that we use because we're openly sharing it, plus the quality of the outputs, and so hopefully they'll be able to take those learnings themselves and maybe be able to build their own bots to do some of this kind of work in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a foundation to work on. Staff who want to experiment and play can do so, and it doesn't take a lot of technical expertise. It's much more subject instructor pedagogical insight to be able to take that prompt and then start tweaking it in order to start generating new ideas as opposed to just redrafting. Yeah. Okay, there was a question about what sources did we use to inform the prompt. Well, Sally already talked about the rich set of sources that were used to ground the Indigenous CILO. I don't know if we really drew on many other sources. Well, yes, we used the knowledge of the writing style that we want to use at UTS for communicating. That was for the course and subject description redraftings that Josh was showing you some examples of. And the rest was just really our own knowledge and expertise about what makes a good silo, which is really within the minds of our own expert team here. Okay. I think we should wrap up now. There was a question about where we're going next, but we talked about that on our last slide in terms of future trajectory. Follow the LX blog. Somebody could drop in the link to the LX blog. That's our learner experience blog at lx.uts.edu.au. That's where we post all of our latest breaking news around education and generative AI. So I just want to thank all my colleagues here whose expertise I think you can appreciate from what you've seen today. It turned out to be an extraordinarily appropriate testbed for harnessing the linguistic abilities of a language model. And we look forward to sharing with you what we do next. So thanks very much, everybody, for joining us.